It's my privilege this morning to introduce this morning's speaker. When some 9 years ago, as a New Testament scholar, I picked up Dan Wallace's voluminous but highly readable Greek grammar, and you would have asked me what I thought he was like, I would have told you, well, maybe he's a rather bookish Greek grammarian. When some 5 years ago I first met Dan at a professional meeting, I found out that that was anything but true. In fact, I would characterize Dan, as I've gotten to know him every successive year at these professional meetings, as we now meet up once a year, as part Indiana Jones with his travels and his task of textual criticism leading him to such faraway places as Cairo, Leningrad, Tokyo, China, Australia, you name it, with some very exciting stories to boot, and also part John Madden. I hear that in his man cave, he's installed bleachers to watch games. And so that becomes one of my life's ambitions now. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you one of the most important advocates and apologists for the Christian faith today, speaking out and defending the Word of God for what it is. Thank you, Dan Wallace.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate that. I have a man cave, huh? I didn't know that. Sometimes when a story is worth telling, it's worth embellishing, I think. So thank you for that, Dr. Perrin. What I want to talk to you about today is this, is what we have now, what they wrote then. What I mean is the New Testament that you have in your hands the same as what the apostles and their associates wrote 2,000 years ago? Some of you use the NIV. Some of you use the ESV, or the New American Standard Bible, or the Net Bible, or the RSV, or NRSV, or REB. There's just so many Bibles out there. In fact, hundreds of them have been produced in the last century, various translations. And you make some comparisons with each other, and you say, well, yours says this, mine says this. What am I supposed to believe? And then we hear last week about a Coptic fragment from the 4th century that said Jesus was married. Well, is that true? Is that what the Bible really says? And then you start to have doubts about, did we get it right? Is the New Testament in my hands the same as what these apostles and their associates wrote 2,000 years ago? Well, this question's been asked for some time, and let me just show you a very great scholar, Dan Brown, in his Da Vinci Code said this. Actually, when he wrote this book, this novel, 2 of our boys were in college at major universities. And when the novel came out the next semester, their professor said, here's a book that finally has proved that Christianity is rooted in myth. It's a novel. And yet that's what these professors were saying. Well, he says here in the book, the Bible has evolved through countless translations, editions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book. We've all heard that. We've heard things like, hasn't the Bible been translated so many times that we can't possibly get back to the original text? Well, that's one perspective, but we're going to wrestle with this in some detail in the few minutes I've got with you today. But let me actually quote from a well-known scholar and a Wheaton graduate who went on to Princeton Seminary, got his master's degree there, his PhD at Princeton Seminary, and then later he decided to abandon the evangelical faith, and then he abandoned the faith altogether and became an agnostic. Dr. Bart Ehrman, who is a bona fide New Testament scholar, wrote a popular book called Misquoting Jesus a few years ago. It's a book about the text of the New Testament, and in that book he says, among other things, the following. Not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the originals, or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. It's almost something you could put to a tune. But Dr. Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, within 3 months sold over 100,000 copies. It became a popular book, a very popular one. Jon Stewart on The Daily Show had him on the program and congratulated him for writing what he called one hell of a book. Not certainly normally the kind of book accolade you'd give for a book about the Bible, but that's what Jon Stewart did. And within 2 days, it shot up to #1 on Amazon. Tens of thousands of people have abandoned the Christian faith because of this particular book as well as some of the other writings of Dr. Ehrman. And what they think he has said is that we can't possibly get back to the original text of the New Testament. We have no idea what it originally said, but we certainly know that Orthodox scribes corrupted it throughout the centuries. Well, let's see what's really going on. There's 4 questions I want us to answer this morning. First of all is how many textual variants are there? We'll define that in just a second. What kinds of textual variations are there? And then third, what theological beliefs? Sorry, got to get this clicker working here. There we go. What theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? Is our faith in jeopardy because of textual variance? Do we have to question the resurrection because every single passage that speaks of the resurrection is not found in all the manuscripts? It's not found in the best manuscripts. It's not found in the earliest. What about the virgin birth, the deity of Christ? How do we deal with these issues? And finally, is what we have now, what they wrote then. So we're going to look at this pretty quickly, but I want to give you an overview of some of these issues. First of all is the number of textual variants we're dealing with. And I want to define what a textual variant is. It's any place among the manuscripts in which there's variation in wording, including word order, omission or additions of words, even spelling differences. Any place in the manuscripts where there could be a single letter difference among the manuscripts, that counts as a textual variant. So if some manuscripts say, in the beginning was the Word, and other manuscripts say, in the beginning was the book, that certainly is a variant. But if one manuscript spells word, W-O-R-D, and another one, W-A-R-D, that's also a textual variant. Well, here's the issue that we want to wrestle with is the number of variants we're dealing with. We can think about it in these terms. The Greek New Testament has approximately 140,000 words in it. Or for those of you who are a little bit anal, it's 138,162 words. Don't ask me how I found that out. Textual variants. We have about 400,000 among the manuscripts. For every word in the Greek New Testament, we have about 2.5 variants. Well, I think that's enough. Let's close in prayer, shall we? No, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you the rest of the story, and we'll look at these variants and see what they're all about. The fundamental point I want to stress to begin with is that the reason we have a lot of textual variants is that we have a lot of manuscripts. If we had only one manuscript, it would have no variants. And for a lot of classical Greek literature or Latin literature, we have a single manuscript. There's no variants, but that's all we've got. And so we can't tell if that goes back to the original text very well or not. We have a lot of variants for New Testament manuscripts because of how many manuscripts we have. And so let me give you a sense of what that looks like. We actually have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the New Testament text. For Greek manuscripts alone, which is what the New Testament was originally written in, we have, as of last week, 5,824 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Now, a lot of these are small scraps, but the average size Greek New Testament is 450 pages long. And we define a manuscript as that which was written before the time of the printing press. We also have the New Testament translated into a variety of languages, such as Latin. And let's see if we can get Latin shown up here. There we go. The count is still, we're still working on it. We don't know exactly how many Latin manuscripts we have. At least 10,000, and it continues to grow. And that's because the church swept into Western Europe early on, and then the church grew in the Latin areas rather than the Greek far more than the Greek areas. Now, we also have early versions, ancient translations of the New Testament into Aramaic and Arabic and Old Church Slavonic and Georgian and Gothic and Coptic and Syriac, a number of languages. The best estimate we have today is somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 ancient versions. But that's a guess. The actual numbers are probably significantly higher than that. And when I have debated liberal scholars on this point, they've never questioned these statistics. But let's say you had a magic wand and you could just wipe out every single handwritten manuscript of the New Testament in the blink of an eye. We would still not be left without a witness. And that's because church fathers, these ancient scholars and priests and abbots of the church, wrote commentaries on the New Testament. And they wrote homilies. And these men were not given to the gift of brevity. And so we have a number of quotations from the church fathers. In fact, the tabulation so far is over 1 million quotations. Generally speaking, they quote a verse at a time at least, and there's fewer than 8,000 verses in the New Testament. So you figured out how many times they're quoting various portions of the New Testament. Many, many verses are quoted dozens and dozens of times. It's remarkable what we've got. We could reproduce virtually the entire New Testament many times over just from the writings of the church fathers. Now, let's see if everything else fits this pattern. Does the rest of the ancient literature look like this? Let's compare the New Testament to the average classical Greek writer. The average classical Greek writer has fewer than 20 copies of his writings still in existence today. And you stack them up, and they're going to be about 4 feet high. Now, how high do you think the stack of New Testament manuscripts would be? Maybe 8 feet high? Maybe hit the ceiling up here? Think about it. Some of you math whizzes are trying to figure this out on your iPhone. Don't do that. Listen to me. I got something I want to say to you. Let's look at it this way. Is it going to be 3 times as much? Maybe a little bit more than that. No, I don't think that's quite enough. I think we need to add more manuscripts to get this looking right. That's as much as I could do in PowerPoint. Multiply that New Testament stack by 8. And it ends up being more than 1 mile high. A mile high of manuscripts, with the average size manuscript being more than 450 pages long, compared to an average of really at best 20 manuscripts for classical authors. And frankly, that is a very, very high estimate. It's usually a lot lower than that, sometimes 1 or 2 manuscripts that we depend on. We'll take a look at some of the more well-known classical authors here right now and just to make a comparison. Just to think in terms of the date of these manuscripts, I'm looking just at historians and biographers. Pliny the Elder, pretty much contemporaneous with the time of the New Testament. We are waiting 700 years before we get to see a single copy of Pliny the Elder's writings. Plutarch wrote, again, at about the same time as the New Testament. We're waiting 800 years before we get copies of Plutarch. Josephus, a very important author for understanding the Jewish war, the history of the Jews, his Antiquity of the Jews, talks about Jesus of Nazareth, talks about James, the brother of Jesus, and John the Baptist. But we are waiting 800 years before we see a single copy of Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews. Then there's Polybius, 1,200 years before we get a single copy of Polybius' writings. Pausanias, who did the geography of Greece. Now, Greece hasn't changed that much, but still, we're waiting 1,400 years before we get a single copy of his writings. Then there's Herodotus. We're waiting 1,500 years before we're getting substantial copies of this most important historian who writes about 400 years prior to the New Testament. Herodotus was a man who was really considered the father of ancient historiography, one of the 2 ancient fathers of that. And we're waiting 1,500 years before we get any substantial copies of his writings. That's not the case with the New Testament. And then finally, sorry, I went ahead just a little bit. We've got Xenophon. Xenophon's Hellenica, very substantial work. We're waiting 1,800 years before we get any copies of any substantial length of Xenophon's Hellenica. Now think about that. If that were the case with the New Testament, we would, and our first substantial copies came 1,800 years later, it would be like having the first copies of the New Testament written sometime after the Wright brothers invented the airplane. Not too many people would think that it's got credibility if it came that late. And yet, scholars of these other ancient pieces of literature don't just throw up their hands and say, we have no idea what they said. What we actually have, on average, is 1,000 times better credibility for the New Testament, 1,000 times better materials, more materials for the New Testament than for the average classical author. So if people are going to be skeptical about, well, the Bible's been translated so many times we can't possibly tell what it originally said, well, we need to answer this. We say, you're absolutely right. We do need to be skeptical about it. We also need to be skeptical about whether somebody by the name of Julius Caesar ever existed or Alexander the Great conquered the world. Those things, the data that we have for them, comes so much later in any manuscripts that it's not even funny. We have to doubt that material 1,000 times more than we do the New Testament. So if people are going to be skeptical, they need to be skeptical in both directions. But they're not willing to do that, of course. Well, that has to do with the number of manuscripts and the date of these other manuscripts. But now let's think just briefly about the date of New Testament manuscripts. And I want to talk to you about the discovery of P-52. This is not a fighter plane that was in prototype during World War II. That's P-51 that was actually used. Here's a photograph of P-52. This is about the size of a credit card. It was discovered in 1934 at Manchester University. Let me give you a little bit of background on it. After all, this is a college, and you know about some of these things that I'm going to be discussing, I think. In the year 1844, in a volume known as the Tübinger Jahrbuch, a professor from Tübingen University in Bavaria wrote, his name was F.C. Bauer, and he wrote about the date of John's Gospel. Now, Bauer had studied under Professor Hegel at the Tübingen University. And you may not know the name Hegel, but you probably know Hegelian dialectic. Now, you may not know Hegelian dialectic by that name, but you probably know thesis, antithesis, and then what's the third one? Synthesis. Okay, you all know that. That's Hegelian dialectic. Sounds like somebody's been studying. F.C. Bauer applied that to the New Testament. He said, you got Petrine Christianity, Peter's version of Christianity. Then you've got Paul's over here, and they're battling each other, and they don't agree at all. Then finally you get the Christianity that we find in the book of Acts and the Gospel of John. But he says, in order for us to get to that synthesis, it takes a lot of years. And in 1844, F.C. Bauer said, the Gospel of John could not have been written any earlier than A.D. 160. And he felt it was probably 170. Now, that means John didn't write it. It's got no historical credibility. It's way too late. And that view held sway in Europe for virtually 90 years until a scholar by the name of C.H. Roberts was rummaging around in the basement of the John Rylands Library at Manchester University in England. He was a papyrologist, and he came across this little scrap of papyrus. And he looked at it, and on one side, it was John chapter 18, verses 31 through 33. He flipped it over, John 31, verses 7, chapter 18, verses 37 and 38. To try to find a New Testament manuscript among papyri is like looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack. We have 127 of them so far out of approximately 1 million papyrus texts that have been discovered. He sent photographs of this manuscript to the 3 leading papyrologists in Europe at the time. Each one independently wrote back to him and said, this manuscript cannot be dated any later than AD 150. And all of them felt it was closer to AD 100. There was a 4th papyrologist who weighed in. He said, no, I disagree with these men. I think the date may go as early as the 90s of the 1st century, when John's Gospel, most scholars think, was written. Now, I don't know about you. I grew up in Southern California. I grew up as a surf bum. But I got a pretty decent education. And our teachers told us that generally speaking, the copies of a document are not written before the original of a document. Is that what you taught here too? It makes sense to me. What this did, this discovery, this one scrap of papyrus did, is it sent 2 tons of German scholarship to the flames. And it really tells us an interesting principle. That is that an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption. Or in this case, an ounce of evidence is worth 2 tons of presumption. And the whole field about John's Gospel changed overnight. No longer could it be considered a document that was written in the second half of the 2nd century. Now it was written in the 1st century, maybe late in the 1st century, but still a 1st century document. That was a huge discovery. And it's not the only manuscript of the New Testament that we have that's written within decades of the New Testament. We actually have as many as a dozen New Testament manuscripts that have been published so far that were written in the 2nd century. Now, has the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times we don't know what it originally said? Another way to look at this is to think in terms of the King James Bible, 401 years ago. It was based on 7 manuscripts, the earliest of which came from the 11th century. Now we have over 5,800 manuscripts, just in Greek alone. Our earliest of them come from the 2nd century. So we have almost 1,000 times as many manuscripts that go back almost 1,000 years earlier. As time goes on, it's not that we're getting farther and farther away. We're getting closer and closer to the original text. That's my first point. And my first point always takes as much time as all the rest of my points. The nature variance. What kinds of variance do we have? I could go on and talk about these for a long time because it's a lot of fun to think about. 99% make virtually no difference at all. For example, there are spelling differences. That's the most common kind of variant we have. Yeah, that's a little better. Scribes didn't know how to spell any better than I do. John spells the same verb. For those of you who are studying Greek, it's the third person singular aorist active indicative of anoigo. He spells it 3 different ways in the space of 8 verses. Inerrancy has nothing to do with spelling. Thank God for that. That's the most common variant we have. 70% of all of our textual variants are spelling variants. The most common one is what's called a movable nu, and that is a nu at the end, an n at the end of the word when the next word starts with a vowel, like a book, an apple. Or at Biola University, they used to say a book, a apple, but this is Wheaton, a little different. I could go on and tell you about a number of variants, but I want to make sure to get through this in the allotted time because I was told that my microphone would be cut off if I didn't finish on time, so I'm going to make sure to deal with that. And then they were going to do something to my legs. I don't recall what it was. But the smallest group of variants are those that are meaningful and viable. That is, they have a good chance of being authentic. How many variants fit in that category? Less than 1% of all textual variants fit this group. In fact, it's about 1/4 of 1% are both meaningful and viable. I'm going to give you one illustration, but we'll talk about another one in just a minute. So we've got, oops, I've got to go back to that. There we go. Revelation 13:18. It's a verse we all know. Let the one who has insight calculate the beast's number, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Everybody knows the Antichrist number is 666. Well, not so fast. There was a manuscript discovered in the middle of the 19th century that has ended up being the second most important manuscript for the book of Revelation. It's a very early manuscript, and it has the number 616 for the number of the beast. Then in 1998 at Oxford University, another manuscript, a papyrus fragment, was discovered, and it happens to be the oldest manuscript we have for Revelation 13, and it also has the number 616 for the number of the beast. I've had the privilege of looking at both of those manuscripts in the flesh, and it's been terrific to verify that that's the case. Now, most scholars would say, we're convinced that 666 is the number of the beast. 616 is, the neighbor of the beast. He lives a few doors down, but not the same. But it could be that 616 is the number of the beast. I don't know. It would take a few hundred hours of research of exhaustive comparisons of these manuscripts, looking at the history of the transmission of the text, and still we wouldn't have a great deal of certainty. But it would really be interesting if in one of our new translations of the Bible coming out in the next few years, it had at Revelation 13:18 the number of the beast as 616. That would send about 7 tons of dispensational literature to the flames, wouldn't it? You may not have heard of I teach at a dispensational school. Anyway, this is a textual variant that's very important. It affects the interpretation of the book of Revelation. But how important is it really? I don't know of a single Christian college, a single seminary, a single denomination, a single institute that has theological convictions of any sort that puts in its doctrinal statement, we believe in the virgin birth of Christ. We believe in the deity of Christ. We believe in the bodily resurrection of Christ. And we believe that the number of the beast is 666. It's important, but it's not that important. And that's the perspective that we need to have. Well, what theological beliefs are dependent on textually suspect passages? Again, I go back to Da Vinci Code. And we have Teabing say, Sir Lee Teabing tells Sophie, "My dear, until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man, nonetheless, immortal." He was talking about the year AD 325 when the Council of Nicaea met, and he was essentially saying what Teabing says is that Emperor Constantine invented the deity of Christ in the year AD 325. Well, let's see if that's really the case. Remember I said an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption? Let's take a look. Here's another early papyrus, P66, and this is about AD 175, about 150 years prior to the Council of Nicaea, prior to the time when Lee Teabing says, by the way, that's when the deity of Christ was invented. This is John chapter 1. Read along with the text, if you would, with me. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." You've never heard that before because this is a text that's prior to Constantine, prior to the invention of the deity of Christ. And the Word was God. Of course you've heard that because that's what every manuscript says at John 1:1. It doesn't matter what the date of it is. And you can go through and look at all of our essential doctrines and you'll see that there are early manuscripts that are very clearly affirming that. In fact, there's another way to put this, and that's what we see in Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus in his appendix. Even he, as much as his book has led tens of thousands of people away from the faith, he was asked a question by the editors in the paperback version. Why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? That's the question they asked. Not, do you believe, but why do you believe? And here's what he had to say. Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variance in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Now, I've debated him 3 times in public, and I always put this quote up. He doesn't like it because he can't disagree with it. He's the one who said it. But here's a man who's a skeptic who admits that no essential doctrine of the Christian faith is jeopardized by any of these textual variants. Now, when a skeptic says that, I think we have some pretty good basis to say our faith is really assured. It's not something that we are basing on just on belief. It's based on the evidence as well. So the question that we began with is what we have now, what they wrote then. Is it in all particulars? I don't know. There are places like Revelation 13:18, another text, where I don't know what the original text is. There's places where the NIV and the ESV and other translations disagree with each other. So is it exactly the same as what they wrote? Probably not. We probably have in the margin verses that need to belong in the text and vice versa. But is it in all essentials? And then I would say, absolutely. Thank you for your attention.